This episode showcases how one man's advertising scheme kicked off an improbable chain of events that would turn a corporation into a naval power, albeit briefly. It's one of capitalism, communism, and a dash of cronyism sprinkled in between. It's a saga that spanned the entire Cold War, from the superheated tensions of the post-war era up to the 90s thaw. When opportunity meets ingenuity, absurd things may be the byproduct, bringing new relevance to the old adage, the truth, well, it's stranger than fiction. It was a muggy day in Solzhenitsyn Park, just a cab ride outside of Moscow's famous Red Square. Solzhenitsyn, derived from Sokol or falcon, served as sovereign hunting grounds during the days of Tsarist Russia. There, generations of czars, beginning with Alexis I, galloped through the wilderness blanketed in birches, spruces, and pines. The whole place represented power. Falcons perched on soft, regal hands wrapped in leather. It was an enclave where elites escaped the shackles of court life to enjoy simple pleasures, while plotting, as do politicians and lobbyists these days over a round of golf. Over time, Russian leaders added personality to the park. Peter the Great brought European-style order by clearing areas and adding pathways. Tsar Nicholas II contributed a maze of alleys. By the late 1800s, coinciding with the waning might of the Tsar system, it opened to the public. Yet it was under the reign of the Soviet Politburo that it finally emerged as a real park, like one you might see in New York or any other Western metropolis, except full of Soviet crap, such as, scowling guards, unsafe rides, and questionable food. With all that history being a hotspot for the upper echelon of society, what better place for Pepsi to execute an ingenious plan for soft drink domination? See, for some time, C-suite executives at Pepsi had been hatching a grand scheme, even consulting, or lobbying, Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Milhous Nixon. The latter, ever the conspirator, forged a close relationship with Donald M. Kendall, World War II bomber pilot turned salesman and marketing executive. From then on, Pepsi had a place at the White House's table and Nixon's ear. All too conveniently, this happened around the time a series of cultural exchanges were taking place between East and West. Ladled with propaganda, Solzhenitsyn was the setting for America's display of Western marvels. Who could have known that a meeting in July 1959 between Nixon and a sweating Nikita Khrushchev would one day lead Pepsi's ascension as a military power, brandishing real weaponry in the Cold War that followed. The time had come for a showdown, East versus West, the dreaded commies versus the land of the free and home of the brave. Who had the best technology? Which culture was superior? We were about to find out. At this point, it's necessary to offer a smidge of context surrounding the event that would unfold. It's easy now to look back at events in history and lose sight of the grave concerns felt by millions at the time. We're seemingly so far removed from the specter of thermonuclear annihilation that it is admittedly challenging to empathize with the prevailing mental state during this period. So, let me, do my best to scare the bejesus out of you. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was flattened by an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy. And 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered a similar fate at the hands of Fat Man. The atomic bombings, coupled with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan, would ultimately convince Emperor Hirohito to surrender. However, Allied total victory would plant the seeds of strife between East and West. As Europe cleared the rubble strewn across the continent, these emergent adversaries swept in to render aid in their own particular ways. America through the Marshall Plan, and the Soviets, with her socialist satellite states, coined an Iron Curtain. The 1948 Berlin airlift was arguably the first clash of the Cold War, although it wasn't in arms and ammunition, but in rendering humanitarian aid. After World War II, Germany was divided amongst the Allies, but so was the nation's capital, Berlin, which was entirely surrounded by the Soviets. The Berlin blockade was an attempt by Stalin to limit the ability of the United States, Great Britain, and France to travel to their respective sectors of the city of Berlin. Stalin feared the U.S. policy of giving economic aid to Germany and other struggling European nations through the Marshall Plan. There was also the idea of introducing a single currency, which really chafed him as well. So the Soviets blocked all railroad and canal access to the western zones of Berlin, which left 2.5 million people without the essential means of survival. So Western powers began an airlift that lasted nearly a year and delivered necessary supplies in relief to West Berlin. It ended up being the largest airlift in human history, conducting more than 270,000 flights in over 11 months. All right, I'm getting the word that I need to speed things up, so let's do that. In 1949, USSR becomes a nuclear power, which shocked the West, especially when we later learned this breakthrough came through a lot of espionage, particularly with the Manhattan Project during World War II. In 1949, NATO forms its Mutual Defense Alliance to challenge Moscow's Iron Curtain, which further draws distinct battle lines across Europe. Then you have the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and a series of high-profile spy cases that terrified Americans. In 1950, the Korean War starts, which lasted till 1953, and kicked off the trend of Cold War proxy wars that would persist up until the USSR's collapse and end of the Cold War. 1953, Stalin dies, which spawns an internal struggle and significant political distress. This also was the year that Dwight D. Eisenhower, the World War II hero and general, is elected. Meanwhile, the nuclear arms race begins to heat up when America test fires the first thermonuclear weapon or hydrogen bomb in an operation called Operation Ivy, which is the namesake for one of my favorite punk bands of all time. The rest of the 50s saw both sides conduct immense military buildups, jockeying for the upper hand, while each technological iteration became increasingly devastating to the prospect of human survival. But it all hit the fan when in 1957 the Soviets launched the first satellite in human history, Sputnik. It changed everything.
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite. Douglas Edwards reporting.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today.
About the vital question that everybody is thinking about, why and how did the Russians beat us to the draw?
Exactly. How in the heck did this happen? Sputnik 1's October 4th, 1957 launch proved a history-shaking event. Why? For starters, around this time, life was extremely good. For most, at least. The post-war economy was a juggernaut. Between 1945 and 1960, personal incomes just about doubled. Eisenhower's combination of low taxes, balanced budgets, and public spending returned about 37% economic growth in the 1950s and historically low unemployment. By the end of the decade, the median American would have about 30% more purchasing power. With pockets flush with cash, it only makes sense for corporations like Pepsi to see this as a rare opportunity to capitalize on the rampant consumerism dominating the era. Advertising became king, and you'll soon see a prime example of the ends marketeers would go to snatch market share. We know there's more to the story, especially regarding racial inequalities. But when most Americans flipped on their TV, this is what they saw. Wholesome fathers knowing best, heroes in white hats, loving marriages, traditional values, stability. Sputnik elevated fears of Soviet sinister purposes and a closed gap between East and West. Moreover, Sputnik was roughly 10 times the size of the first planned U.S. satellite, which was not scheduled to be launched until the next year. The U.S. government, military, and scientific community were caught off guard by the Soviet technological achievement. How could a nation of peasants ravaged by war and under the yoke of communism best us? Such questions would galvanize America to redouble efforts to catch up with the Soviets. Sputnik was so important that it coined the term Sputnik moment, and it's still used today. This refers to a cultural and societal trigger mechanism, an event so critical it constitutes a tidal or paradigm shift, a moment in time where it becomes urgently necessary to take action and redouble efforts in advance of some existential challenge. Fortunately, America had a plan to show up the Soviets and prove that the West truly was the best. Sputnik be damned. They'd leveraged the ongoing cultural exchanges, this one on Soviet turf at Solkoniki Park, to punch back. While the Yanks flooded in, so too did Pepsi marketeers with their own strategy to best their competition. But first, what was this cultural exchange to begin with? The American National Exhibition was meant to forge cultural empathy between East and West. To support this effort, an architectural firm designed the typical American house. Constructed on those former royal lands at Solkoniki, it served as capitalism's counterargument to the Soviet Union's New York exhibit earlier that year. As one might guess, consumerism was the choup du jour in Moscow that particular day. The Soviets used their display to laud the technological virtues of communism. Off the heels of Sputnik, Soviet ingenuity was omnipresent. Music, the arts, and agricultural machinery were also prominent aspects of this whole propaganda ploy. And let's not get it sideways either. Americans would be serving up a whole lot of propaganda too. In these instances, highlighted technologies illuminated each side's propaganda strategy, domestically and abroad. The Soviets, now they promoted math, science, rocketry, and harvesting equipment. Meanwhile, America heralded the dawn of the dishwasher and toaster. All hail consumerism. Repent or we'll give you the washboard. One must appreciate the humor. The Soviet focus on outer space and farming was a clever way to signal to international and domestic audiences that they were interested in great and noble achievements. Americans, on the other hand, sought to showcase everything the proletariat was missing out on while huddled in their cramped concrete, dimly lit studio apartments. In other words, great job with the satellite, you bunch of nerds. Now try to build a car. A real car. And not one powered by a 5 horsepower lawnmower motor. Still, the entire exchange remains puzzling. Basically, it was a state-sponsored dick measuring contest. And what the heck is with communism's obsession with agriculture? For something that's been around for thousands of years, they still seem enthralled by it. Wow, corn harvesting. How riveting. Okay, this does warrant an explanation. When Khrushchev returned to his birthplace near the border of present-day Ukraine, he witnessed utter devastation. About 1 in 6 Ukrainians had died during the war. Imagine that. Yeah, don't have too much to add here other than it's fair to say that Ukraine was caught in the middle of a buzzsaw. The advancing mechanized arms of the Reich cleaved through the fertile landscape they sought to one day transform into an Aryan breadbasket. Meanwhile, Soviet guerrillas repelled invaders from burnt-out, rubble-strewn villages or scorched them to prevent enemy provisioning. Not to mention all the repressive tactics the two sides took to instill subjugation amidst the war-torn chaos. Whether clad in Nazi or Soviet regalia, Ukrainians suffered under the thumb of the oppressive gravity of total war. To make matters worse, Ukrainians suffered arguably the worst man-made, wholly preventable famine in human history. The Holodomor famine, also known as the Ukrainian famine or the Great Famine, that occurred in Soviet Ukraine between 1932 and 1933. The famine was caused by Soviet policies that aimed to collectivize agriculture and increase grain exports, leading to a severe shortage of food for the Ukrainian people. The Soviet government also implemented policies that restricted the movement of people and food, exacerbating the famine's effects. Estimates vary, but it is believed that between 3.3 and 7.5 million people died during the famine, with the majority of the victims being ethnic Ukrainians. Naturally, the government denied the existence of the famine and refused to provide aid to the starving population, instead intensifying its efforts to collectivize agriculture. And who says, collectivization is what we need now? Oh, you adorable modern Bolsheviks munching your ethically sourced tofu lettuce wraps. Khrushchev was obsessed with corn, and now you know why. He even sought to develop a corn belt rivaling Iowa, going so far as inviting an Iowan farmer and a pioneer in hybrid seed corn, Roswell Garst, to visit the USSR as a consultant of sorts. Garst gave pointers such as not planting in desolate, lifeless places like Siberia, but Khrushchev, he wanted corn. Corn everywhere! Had dating apps existed back then, Khrushchev's profile would read, "I like corn and space. Any other subjects bore me, and they will be utterly, completely ignored. I will bury those conversations." In all seriousness, Khrushchev took a liking to Garst. His chilly disposition matched his own. Their exchanges were an incessant tit-for-tat. When Cold War politics came up, the Soviet premier snapped, "You know, for a peasant, you're a damned poor horse trader." I know, that's a terrible Russian accent, but whatever. Garst traveled the globe advocating modern agricultural methods, including the Soviet Union 6 times. During Khrushchev's 1959 12-day U.S. tour, he demanded to add a stop in Coons Rapids, Iowa, to meet his old friend. He was the only individual the leader visited besides the president. Now, some considered Garst a traitor and Soviet stooge. His daughter Liz, though, well, she believes he represented the first thaw in the Cold War. The typical American house was the site of the famous kitchen debate. It created the perfect opportunity for Pepsi to get their massive plug. Here's how it happened. American and Soviet media were filming the entire meet and greet between the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Try saying that 3 times fast. and Dick Nixon. The idea was for each country to simultaneously televise the exchange to ensure no funny business. Though, to be honest, American networks jumped the gun. Of course. Both men stood in the exhibit's kitchen as Dick explained how this home mirrored the average house in California. When Nixon pointed at the dishwasher, lauding how it helped the housewives, Khrushchev brushed it off, saying, "We have such things. Your capitalistic attitude towards women does not occur under communism." After extolling how any Soviet citizen can get a newly built house without a dollar to their name, unlike America, he mockingly suggested that workers failed to properly finish the exhibit. Let's watch a little bit of this exchange. Went on. This is what America is capable of? How long has she existed? 300 years? We haven't quite reached 42 years, and in another years, we'll be at America's level. As we pass you by, we'll wave hi, and if you want, we'll stop and say, "Please come along behind us." Cue the comical exchange of Khrushchev waving his hand, grinning ear to ear, while Nixon could only muster a bewildered, forced smirk. The barbs continued back and forth, and both parties maintaining composure without giving quarter. Nixon emphasized the importance of a free exchange of ideas, not fear of them. Of course, this received a sharp retort that the Soviets feared nothing. Eventually, they agreed to translate the full text of the exchange to each other's nations and then departed. Although the kitchen debate garnered all the attention, what happened before is of particular interest. Outside the house, Khrushchev was having a rough go of things. Hot and sweaty, Nixon coaxed him over to the Pepsi stand, helmed by marketing savant Mr. Kendall. When offered the choice between a bottled Pepsi from the great state of New York or the sweet, syrupy concoction from local water in Russia, Khrushchev took the latter. Known as the first skeptical sip of Pepsi, the picture was a marketing boon. Kendall was under strict orders to get a damn Pepsi in Khrushchev's hands and would have been in trouble had he failed. The best part is that Khrushchev tried the American-made Pepsi and immediately rejected it, proclaiming, "Drink the Pepsi Cola made in Moscow. It is much better than the Pepsi made in the US." Don Draper couldn't pull off a coup like this in his wildest dreams, especially when Pepsi's slogan at the time was, "The sociables prefer Pepsi." Think about it for a moment. Sour, dour Khrushchev hates everyone and everything except a nice cold Pepsi. It took a while, but in 1972, Pepsi finally capitalized on the photo op with Kendall at the helm as CEO. In the great Stolichnaya for syrup barter, as I like to call it, Pepsi agreed to manufacture in Russia in exchange for marketing and importing Soviet vodka. Essentially, Pepsi took vodka instead of greenbacks. Yes, you can thank Pepsi for the vodka concoctions in red solo cups of drunken co-eds making bad decisions in Cancun. Where would we be without that? With that agreement, Pepsi became the first American consumer product in the Soviet Union. The first. Let there be no mistake though, Soviet Pepsi wasn't great. However, as the only game in town, it quickly became a Soviet staple. In fact, it became so popular, it was said to be the quickest way to get a nice Russian gal in the sack. Forget tiramisu, champagne, and Barry White, Pepsi was the aphrodisiac. The same can't be said in the US. Oddly, Pepsi came to be viewed by the Soviets as, well, Soviet. It wasn't until the end of the Cold War that other options like Coca-Cola arrived. By that time, Pepsi had developed a vast distribution network across 22 million kilometers, 1/6 of Earth's inhabited landmass. But in 1989, problems arose. Both sides needed to renegotiate the terms of the deal as it was set to expire. Soviets were jonesing for more Pepsi, so an even crazier contract was reached. The infamous syrup for subs and vodka switcheroo, as I call it, estimated at $3 billion, was the largest trade in history between an American company and the USSR. Once again, the Soviets couldn't pay, and this time vodka wasn't enough to close the gap. Let's clarify. Pepsi taking vodka was supposed to reduce exposure to rubles, the Russian currency. Look, you have to understand that the ruble was a quasi-currency that operated more like company scripts you might have heard about. You know that song, 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. Then it goes, I sold my soul to the company store. Kind of like that. Sure, there were methods to convert rubles for international purposes, but for the most part, rubles were useless, especially to Pepsi, or any foreign investor for that matter. With Russian currency out of the question, ships emerged as a suitable substitute. Why? Well, that's simple. Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership during a brutal time. Plagued by a stagnant economy, waning confidence, and severe shortages, Gorbachev knew the Soviet system had gone rotten. The centrally planned economy was failing the consumer needs and tastes. It's impossible to plan and provide for nearly 300 million people. That's where free market capitalism comes into play. To further stoke the problem, the Soviet-Afghan war was bleeding them dry. It necessitated a colossal build-off that siphoned resources from economic restructuring. U.S. Stinger missiles magnified the problem as well. Gorbachev, eager to end shortages and improve distribution, viewed a renewed deal with Pepsi as a critical test of his leadership, which is a weirdly true statement. Should it be successful, other Western companies could also find success in a marketplace oftentimes marked by missteps. Gorbachev, with his dual policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, sought to save the USSR through urgent reforms. In the end, he likely brought the inevitable demise even sooner. On April 9, 1990, the USSR and Pepsi finalized their deal. They added 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, a destroyer, and a few oil tankers to their books. The ruthless negotiators at Pepsi even nabbed an incredible discount on the Suds, about $150,000 a pop. Now, the CIA had to be involved through a shadowy subsidiary. The whole saga deserves a film franchise produced by Jerry Bruckheimer and starring Nicolas Cage with Jack Black as the zany sidekick. Suddenly, the soft drink giant positioned itself as a maritime power commanding the 6th most diesel submarines in the world. While Coca-Cola had Santa, polar bears, and his airness Michael Jordan, Pepsi possessed true might, Soviet might, and Michael Jackson, of course. Pepsi would ultimately scrap the ships to reimburse costs. Yet, for a few days, the cola company, like Great Britain before, triumphantly ruled the waves. The balance briefly tipped as the Cola War slogged on. Relishing the moment, Donald Kendall told President George H.W. Bush's national security advisor, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." But the victory proved short-lived. When the USSR collapsed, Pepsi's connection with the Soviet past turned into a liability amongst consumers who wanted a true American soft drink, not Soviet crap or new Coke. So Pepsi diversified from her cola-centric roots, ceding market share, while the rebranded Coca-Cola Classic swooped in to satisfy proletarian thirst. Yes, Pepsi might have won a Cold War battle, but inevitably lost the vitally important Cola War. Yet, it was this photo op that spurred a measure of disarmament. One eager marketeer executing a zany idea slightly opened a closed part of the world. That would have never happened had other zany marketeers or propagandists decided against creating a cultural exchange in the first place. Though the bitter rivals were driven by ideological one-upsmanship, the outcome of these exchanges was clearly uncertain. Still, isn't that how exchanges go with those at odds? In a world full of misunderstanding and preconceived notions, engagement, well, it seems to offer a glimmer of hope. Engagement allows a chance, albeit small sometimes, for progress. The alternative is fear, resentment, and miscalculation. To me, that isn't a road worth taking. Heck, a farmer from Iowa managed to crack Khrushchev's cold, cantankerous demeanor. That speaks volumes.